By way of introduction, I need to tell you that Victoria is in caretaker mode because of our upcoming election. And because of that, I'm only allowed to talk facts, which might prove quite a challenge to me, but we'll see how we go. So, the first thing to tell you is that in Victoria we've been on quite a journey in relation to the end of life. So there have been a number of policies and documents that have been, and legislation that have been developed over the last few years in relation to end-of-life care. I won't go into any of them, but just to note that there's been quite a bit of work. In relation to voluntary assisted dying, the Parliamentary Social and Legal Issues Committee at the beginning of 2016 asked for an inquiry looking at end-of-life choices. So it was a very broad consultation. They did public hearings, they did public meetings, stakeholder meetings, and visited some places overseas where voluntary assisted dying has been legalised. They made 49 recommendations, of which one was around voluntary assisted dying. Then in 2017, the Health Minister established an advisory panel consisting of 7 people with various expertise, who then undertook specific consultation and stakeholder meetings and helped to shape up the legislation that went to Parliament towards the end of last year and was passed by the Parliament in November of last year. The culmination of all that work over 2 years was underpinned by these principles. I won't read through them, but just to note, they come from the Victorian Charter of Human Rights, and they have been something that has guided all of this work all the way through. And it's provided continuity and consistency of what has now gone into the legislation. So the Now Act, provides for and regulates voluntary assisted dying. There are considerations that do need to be addressed, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it does 3 things. It establishes the eligibility criteria. It takes a person through a very detailed assessment, request and assessment process. It sets up a voluntary assisted dying permit process, and also establishes the reporting and governance framework to oversee the Act. And there are a number of safeguards. In fact, I think there were about 69 safeguards. It was pointed out that they were the most in the world in relation to this sort of legislation. So the eligibility criteria, first of all, a person must meet all of these criteria. So they must be aged 18 or over, be an Australian citizen or permanent resident, and be a resident in Victoria. Have decision-making capacity in relation to voluntary assisted dying, and be diagnosed with a disease, illness or medical condition that's incurable, that's advanced, progressive and will cause their death, is expected to cause that death within weeks or months, not exceeding 6 months, except 12 months for someone who has a neurodegenerative condition, and is causing suffering that cannot be relieved in the manner that the individual deems to be tolerable. In relation to the request and assessment process, it's a 3-staged process, and the person must make 3 separate requests. The first one is a verbal request to their medical practitioner, and there is allowance in the legislation for that request to be made in ways other than verbal if the person cannot do that. The medical practitioner may become the coordinating medical practitioner, that is, they oversee the whole process, and the person undergoes a first assessment with that person, and then a second assessment with the second medical practitioner, who's called the consulting medical practitioner. The second step is a written request, which is witnessed by 2 independent people, And the third is a final verbal request to the coordinating medical practitioner, and there must be at least 9 days that have passed between the first request and the last request. So if the person is deemed to be eligible, the coordinating medical practitioner needs to apply for a permit from the Department of Health and Human Services to prescribe the substance. If the person is physically able to self-administer and digest the substance, the practitioner applies for the self-administration permit. If the person is not able to administer the substance themselves, they apply for a practitioner-administered permit. And the emphasis in the legislation is on self-administration. There are various aspects of who can be involved in the Act in terms of medical practitioners, and they are very clearly outlined in the Act. So the coordinating medical practitioner, as I said, is the person that sees through the whole process. The second person just provides the second consulting assessment. They both need to make sure that the person is properly informed of all treatment and care options, including palliative care, and what the likely outcomes of that will be. And they must undertake independent assessments to inform the view as to whether the person meets the criteria, understands the information that's being given to them, is acting voluntarily and without coercion, and that their request is enduring. In relation to health practitioners, there is no requirement that health practitioners be involved in VAD. Conscientious objection has been enshrined in Victorian law and does apply here as well. A health practitioner is not permitted to initiate discussion about VAD, and there are protections and prosecutions in the legislation if someone does raise the discussion. So there are protections for health practitioners and paramedics who act in good faith in accordance with the Act, and there are a range of offences, as I just said, for raising the discussion about VAD, for falsifying records, or providing or administering VAD without a permit. Oops. In terms of the medical practitioners, only specialist medical practitioners, and that includes members of the College of General Practitioners, can conduct the process and prescribe the substance. Between them, they must have at least 5 years post-fellowship experience, and so that is to protect junior doctors from being involved in VAD, and they must have experience and expertise in the person's disease or illness. They must be fellows of a specialist medical college, including the College of GPs, and they must complete a compulsory training program before they do an assessment. In the law, conscientious objection, as I said, is enshrined in the law, and it lists 6 ways that someone can conscientiously object. They can say they don't want to provide any information about VAD. They can say they don't want to participate in the request and assessment process. They don't want to apply for the permit. They don't want to apply for the substance or to be involved in administering the substance. They can say they don't want to be present at the time of administration of the substance or to dispense a prescription for the substance. So it's not just a matter of saying, I conscientiously object. One must say what one is conscientiously objecting to. The Voluntary Assisted Dying Review Board was established a couple of months ago, and they are responsible for the oversight and reporting process of the legislation. I won't go through it, but just to say that at every stage there is reporting that will be able to be visible by the Review Board. And the reporting in the first instance to Parliament will be 6 monthly. So in relation to health services, they do need to decide whether they will be involved in offering VAD, and this would be similar to health services saying they will or won't do any other medical intervention. Some hospitals do transplants, some don't. This is exactly the same. But regardless of whether they will or won't be involved in VAD, they must be prepared for this new legislation, and they need to consider things like how they will prepare their staff to respond to requests for VAD, how they will be supported and educated around those requests. If VAD is or isn't being provided, what will be the model of care, and the support of staff right across the health service. So organisational readiness will need to encompass all aspects of an organisation, and the message certainly has been that in many policies and guidelines there will be information there already that services can use. There will not necessarily need to be a whole lot of new guidelines. There will be some that they can draw on. And the aim of the legislation is that the voluntary assisted dying will be as much part of a healthcare service as possible. So unlike a place like Switzerland where they have independent places where people go to die, this will be embedded within healthcare services. So the implementation process, which started in January and will continue through to when the Act is implemented on the 19th of July next year, the task force has a range of things to do. There are 5 working groups, as you can see there, plus a number of other pieces of work that need to be completed. So I'm chairing the model of care group, and we're fairly much developed in terms of how the model of care will practically be implemented. There is consumer information that's being developed. There are clinical guidelines that will work in tandem with the model of care. There's a training workshop for doctors, the training assessment program for doctors, and the medications and the protocols that sit around that. So it's a significant amount of work that needs to be done in what seems to be a short period of time. And I'll just leave you with a small editorial comment. And if anyone wants information further to this, you can get onto the health.vic.gov.au and put in voluntary assisted dying or the Better Health channel. There are 2 sources of information.